Tom Kostigen, the author. Can capitalism save the planet and be a force for good? Can entrepreneurs help save the world? Las Vegas has historically never cared for much other than making money and showing people a good time. Its symbol is more likely to be the dollar bill and not a Save the Earth bumper sticker. But is unfeathered capitalism something we can still afford? Tom Kostigen has thought long and hard about these issues. Director of Sustainability at communications firm J. Connolly, he has grappled with the best ways to use the tools of capitalism and the drive of the entrepreneurial mindset to help the planet, from ecotourism to global water preservation to the greater philosophy of corporate social responsibility. We talked to this best-selling author who's published more than 10 books, most recently of You Are Here, exposing the vital link between what we do and what that does to our planet, about humanity's future and if capitalism can be part of the solution. In the Fox and the Henhouse documentary, I talk a little bit about the original idealistic reasons I ventured into entrepreneurship, rooted a little bit in Herb Kelleher's vision of how to treat stakeholders. Tom and I discuss about the practicality of that wishful thinking and if it's possible to implement it in real life. So I've written a couple books myself.
Yeah.
You've written 10.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, I have a very curious mind. And so sometimes I go down these alleys, and let's call that some type of curiosity. Like, I hear something that just tweaks that bit of like, what's that about? For example, concrete is now the second most consumed material on the planet besides water.
Wow, is that a fact?
That's a fact. So it gives that wow moment. Then you kind of go down that alley. And sometimes you run into a wall and it's just like, oh, that's
concrete.
it.
Oh, sorry.
Done.
Bad
right?
one.
But then you go, wait a minute, there might be a whole city behind that wall. Why is it that way? What has that done to, say the planet? What, comprises concrete? Is it healthy? You start to go down all these different alleyways and sometimes there's this whole world that opens up. Then it's a book. Otherwise, it might be a podcast, it might be an article, might just be something you have and talk about for yourself, and that's it. But it's that nugget, or I like to call it factoid, of curiosity that gets me going. And I've been trained as a journalist, and still am in many senses for 20-something years now. So when I write columns, now that I'm doing more consulting on the media side to get people to talk about what they do and communicate their messaging, then it's a different but similar story. What is it, that one thing that's really intriguing? Is then it's just not talking about what's interesting to you. You've realized there's a whole school of thought behind it.
So you use the word journalism, and there's so many things I want to chat about, but let's just double click on that. So you got journalists, you got columnists, and then you also now, in the last decade have bloggers.
Yeah.
Now you also have these influencers.
Yeah.
Very different set of ethics and guidelines. You work in a PR organization, so you're obviously got a very interesting perspective from both the, the PR side and like the storyteller side. Are these things going to blur into one? And then first of all, how would you define a journalist or journalism? Because I got follow-up questions there. But then, that spectrum of storytelling, is it all going to become one, or are they going to become more specific?
I think you just answered it. You said storyteller, and I think that's brilliant, because we're all storytellers, and it's just the type of story that you're telling. When you talk about different things, obviously, verbal storytelling is the most ancient form of media. And so now that's coming back into vogue with podcasts. There are some podcasts that are, journalism, and then there are some podcasts that are entertainment, and then there are some podcasts that are opinion. And what I think defines this is less so the medium we're finding, because you can't do it that way. Cable TV, what is that? Is that journalism or is it opinion? It's everything. Radio, same thing. Same thing with print. So I think you have to take a more of a critical look than you have at any other time in history, especially when it comes to social media, because then it becomes even more bifurcated.
So journalism is under fire, is on fire actually, and under fire for many reasons. But I always comment that the early monopolies in media, which were like the local news organizations, were making, it was like classifieds business and local ads business. They happened to then say, hey, we got all this money, let's fund journalism and news reporting that is really expensive. And then with the Craigslists and the Facebooks and the Googles that disrupted the local ad market, these news organizations don't have the same cash flow. But today, it's not like Google, Facebook, prima facie at face value need to have the same commitment to journalism. So that model is broken, right?
Yeah,
so in your opinion, do the Googles and the Facebooks have a responsibility to either fund directly or really support and ensure the survival of journalism?
I think that they have an ethical responsibility because they are disseminators of information. Do they have any type of regulatory type of filter? No, and nor should they. Because now you're starting to get into some type of prohibition of free speech, which we're seeing play out much more than we have at any time, I think, because it's just so easy to say something that's nefarious or insightful or could cause harm, and have lots of people tune into that. So where are the filters? I think what we need is a disclosure mechanism on all sorts of media so that we know where that source is coming from. So it's disclosed up front, just as they might do as a printed supplement within the New York Times or The Economist, and you see them all the time that says advertisement. We should have the same thing with cable news, same thing with the type of program you're tuning into. If it's going to be a talking head, let's take Sean Hannity, who defines himself as an opinionator. He should, there should be disclosure about that. The same thing on the other side, on CNN, when there's political opinions being rendered. So I think we really need to be more transparent with things, and that will solve a lot of the problems. At the same time, we need a lot of education. It's a really tough issue, though, when it comes to Google and Facebook, isn't it? Because they are virtual mirrors of society. And so while at the same time it's repugnant for white supremacists to walk through the streets and say the repugnant things that they do, if we stop them from doing that, who's the arbiter of someone who's promoting, gender equalization, that type of thing, that we all would like to support? So the arbiters, I think, are really in question here, and I'm not sure how it's going to play out, and it's going to be a very interesting decision for both Google and Facebook, and I would argue YouTube, or I would argue even an Instagram, how you can regulate.
I mean, that's the thing, right? Because we are on YouTube, we're a very large channel, so we kind of get their perspective, and because these are all user-generated content platforms, they want to be able to benefit from the 4 safe harbors of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, meaning that they cannot actually determine, is this hate speech, is this copyright infringement? Right. That if they make that call, they lose the safe harbors. And now what you're seeing is in the EU and other places, people saying, no, you should make that call. So they are in a very weird dynamic. Yeah. Like, you need to further define the law and say, well, where do you draw the line? And how much could you step in and say this content we're going to take off without losing the 4 safe harbors? So aside from the ethical, moral, semantic, discussion, philosophical, there's a whole Pandora's box of legal ramifications that they are racking their heads trying to figure out. So it's interesting that you touch base on Facebook and YouTube and Google and all this. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about communications for these companies, and in your perch in terms of overseeing the corporate sustainability practice. How do you define, first of all, corporate sustainability?
It's about having a social conscience as a corporation. We now consider corporations in the United States with the same rights as citizens, as you probably well know. And there was a wonderful documentary done called The Corporation about that. So as corporations become citizens, there needs to be a same participation in society as your average person. And that comes down to a conscience. So what are you doing for your community? What are you doing for your employees? How are you making things a pleasant environment in which people can work and then have a really nice life afterwards? And what are you doing for the environment? So all of those things, environmental, social, and corporate governance issues, come into the workplace in a very positive way. And sometimes, and oftentimes actually, companies do the right thing, and they want to do the right thing. And there's now corporate social responsibility officers, and there's now, diversity officers, and there's all sorts of things going on in companies because they realize, yeah, we want to do this. We're just good corporate citizens. We'll do that. But where they fall down is communicating that. So, how are you messaging that? Are you really looking at all the different types of protocols that you're abiding by? You're picking the right ones, and then how are you relaying that information to not only your employees and your managers, but your supply chain and your consumers? And often it's the same type of information, but it's not directed in the right way. I flew over here in United, and the first time I've seen this is this interstitial that talks about their environmental awareness, what they're doing for the environment, and how you can do something too. That last bit is really interesting and really important because we often see companies say, this is what we're doing charitably, and this is what we're doing in terms of diversification within our company. But they do it in such a McKinsey clinical way that it's just, goes nowhere. But when you have a millennial class that wants to shop at companies that are doing the right thing, that are more environmentally friendly, that do have social and corporate governance protocols in place, when you have employees that say they actually like to work there and will stay longer, and then you have retirement-ready people saying, we actually want more ESG types of investments in our retirement plans, you look at the spectrum of that and you go, that's really interesting. If you look at all of your different stakeholders, why wouldn't you go that way? And if you're going to go that way, why aren't you doubling down on celebrating that? Like, tell everybody you're doing that, because what happens then?
Look, I accidentally wanted to tip a pizza delivery guy $25 on a 12 orders of 12 pizzas. I tipped him 25%, and when he told me about it, I said, thanks for your honesty, keep it. But the second I brag about it, or the second I say that, then I'm bragging about it, so it loses its effect. I think corporations, that's the struggle. There is actually somebody that goes, hey, we did this great thing, but we can't actually talk about it, So it's kind of like, it's a delicate thing, which I want to get to. But, the difference between the intention of an individual or organization and how it's perceived ultimately boils down to your actions, your words, and your behavior. So, do you feel that by and large corporations do that they deliver on their intentions well and it's perceived as it is? Or do you think that the majority cases are not actually perceived the way it was intended? And I guess the answer, how big it is, depends how successful you PR firms are.
Yeah, well, no, I think it's actually not true. You can't communicate something that's inauthentic. There must be an authenticity behind it. And I don't want to work with a company that's not authentic. People don't want to frequent a company that's not authentic. Sometimes people aren't very upfront or transparent about their authenticity, but there are ways to look at that. And there are ways to really, kick the tires and do your due diligence. And those are the types of companies we want to work with, and I only will work with. Otherwise, now that infection comes to me, right? And us. So when you start to look at something that's authentic, and to get back to your original point, I think it's like people. I travel around the world, I'm sure you do too, and everyone thinks they're kind of special. But I got to tell you, from the remote areas of China to the jungles of the Amazon to the Pacific Islands to New York City, we're all pretty much the same. We all pretty much go through life the same way. We want the same things, we want to be happy, we want our kids to be happy. That's what we're all about.
We're driven by insecurities.
Yeah, we all have the same stuff going on, right? And I think corporations, by and large, are the same way. If you are hurt in some place, most people are going to help you. In most places around the planet, right? There are some schmucks, right, who aren't going to do that. There are some bad apples, and it's the same thing with companies. I think they're a reflection of us. And I think you have to really take a look at that. Don't get me wrong. You have to really hold, especially companies who can get more easily distracted than the average individual into an earnings trap and into an idea that we can only seek profits because that is our mission. And I think that's very much old school, type of thinking. The 1980s we're just going to buy things, rip them apart, and sell them off in pieces, right? I mean, we laugh now looking at that because you go, wow, that was really the mentality. Greed is good. Greed can be good and do well, and I think that's the point now. We have to get beyond profit and go to purpose, and that just translates.
Fascinating. So you touched on two things. I'll put them down as blocks. You could connect them. And so you got the millennials, that as much as it's unfair to cast them all as one homogeneous group, but millennials, true, they do want all this stuff. Responsibility, sustainability, respect, higher wages, which we all do, but it is a different kind of thinking than previous generations. So my first question is, as they get older, do you think that they're going to kind of become jaded, cynical, and once they got mortgages, they'll forget and they'll become like every other class that gets old, like, hey, now I got a mortgage to pay, I got a 401k. And so one, that's the first question. And then two, do you feel like these corporations that are today showing a lot of concern about sustainability and, respect for all stakeholders and doing well, is it a fad? Is it because, sure, as decent human beings, they want to do the right thing, but they also feel like it's the theme of the day, so they're really kind of leaning in. But as the millennials, if it's indeed they, like everybody else, becomes a cynic and sell out, and this fad passes, in 5 years are we going to look, or 5 or 10 years, are we going to look back and say, oh, remember the way you just talked about greed? Remember that sustainability period where we pretended we cared about things like, which are common decent human traits. Yeah. But so do you think that's the case, or is this really an inflection point? Is this a change that going forward, we're always going to be like, oh, now corporations are these very fluffy, huggable, great things?
Well, I'll take the last point first, and then I'll talk about the millennial generation. I think that two hard, very direct answers. This isn't a fad. There's no way it's a fad. It's like saying, we're not going to use fossil fuels when they were, started to be used for everything in industry. I mean, there's just no way you can stop this train now that we're making infrastructure the way we're making infrastructure, the new technologies that are coming out in terms of renewable energy, the way that we think. Once you get past the point of saying, oh, we can do that, there's no going back, man. I mean, you can't just say, well, we're going in that direction. Nah, that's a good thing. We're going to go in a different direction. It doesn't work that way. Once the curious brain starts to take over, it becomes cyclical and serial. And so I think we're on this direction. It's much like public health. Once we realize that vaccines worked and they can make you feel better quick, then all of a sudden the natural remedies kind of went to the side.
But really? Because right now, the anti-vaxxers, it's bad.
That's like, and if you ask...
No, you're right, in the grand
scheme of things, right? So we've gone on this path and we haven't gone back to that in the same way. Nothing wrong with natural medicines. I take natural medicines myself, but I'm just saying.
You're going to be getting an email, the memo, why did you trash the... No, I'm kidding.
It's okay. The point is, you can have a little bit of both, right? But the majority is, this is the way of the future. When you talk about the millennials, and I don't think, by the way, I don't think being environmentally friendly, socially responsible, and having these types of systems and mandates in place is soft. And I don't think it's huggable. And I don't think
it actually takes courage. It
takes courage to do that. So I don't think it's pejorative in that sense. No. I think it's actually a very risky thing for companies to do. And now they're starting to see allies come into it. So you're starting to see stakeholders and come into place. And now they're saying, well, we have to do it because if we want to sell to this guy as a retailer, we have to get our act together too. And that's how it works.
Let me put it in context. So, sorry, I worked in customer service, and I kind of was like, when I was still in college studying finance, and I loved it because I liked to serve, and whether it's when I was a waiter and all that, I love that. But I was like, I came up with this concept of first call problem resolution. And it was like, hey, instead of getting these clients to keep calling when they're unhappy and we just send them and refer them to another department, just empower the agent to fix it. And the company was like, this is fantastic, great. And like as I was walking out, like they were shredding it. I was like, what? And it taught me at that point, very cynically maybe, and I stuck my idealistic ways, but I was like, do companies really care? No, because it's just paying lip service and all that. I do think times have changed, right? So
I think when they start to see new business and you start to see revenues increase and you start to see alpha go that way, that changes the conversation a lot.
Fair enough, and I think that there's so much more competition, and competition, even just the scope has changed. Whereas before, let's say I was, working, taking calls on behalf of Visa, it was like, I'm going to cancel and go to MasterCard. Now it's like Apple Pay, which may be connected on the back end with something, but there's just the options have changed. So, Herb Keller of Southwest used to say, focus first on your employees. Then if your employees are happy, your clients will be taken care of, and that creates shareholder value. Do you think that is the way of the future, or do you think it's more, think of what, every decision should be made in terms of what's good for my shareholder, and then if you please shareholders, then you have the power to then reward your employees and take care of your clients. How do you view, if I'm sitting with you as a CEO and I'm saying, look, I'm looking to hire you guys, what's your hierarchy of stakeholders? Yeah,
I think this is a real shift, and that's going to dovetail into the millennials too. We have an entirely new way of looking at stakeholders now. It's people, because investors, let's not forget, are people. They're also employees. They're also consumers, and they happen to work at a place. And we put people in these boxes and say, well, our consumers, or our investors, or our employees, it's all we're all the same people. And I think that is the through line for everything. So, it's not just to please the employees. It's not just to please shareholders. At the end of the day, is it to please consumers? I think you start there. And you say, because that's our market, right? That's what we have to sell to. And if you're looking at what's going to please consumers, this becomes part of that matrix. And that is being borne out in numerous studies and analysis that people want to shop at a place that does good and does right by their employees. So now you get that benefit as well. So I think if you start with the goal and work your way back, we want to make a product we want to make a car. We want to make the best car possible. And how can we do that that's going to please the next generation? The answer is probably going to be electric at this point, right? So now let's work our way back from that and see what is going to make that sing. And, we all know a company that's been doing that, but have they messaged that correctly? I would say, I'll say it out now, no. We hear a lot of other people talking about the great messaging. We hear a lot of other people, which is great for them, reinforcing that value system, because that's really what we're talking about. But we don't really have that oracle coming from the organization. And that's what I think we need more of.
So you mentioned electric. So how do you define, and what's the concept and the spirit behind the climate survivalist concept?
Well, the climate survivalist concept is basically we have to face our future now. And how do we do that from an adaptation and a mitigation standpoint? But more importantly, how can we create and embrace and celebrate silver bullets and moonshots that will take care of environmental degradation and climate change today? And there are numerous innovations, there are numerous inventions, and there are numerous social entrepreneurs out there doing amazing things. I've spent the last 2 years traveling around the world looking at these types of new approaches to climate intervention, new approaches to making a positive environment from an energy waste and water perspective, and then talking to these really mind-bending and risk takers who are the inventors behind them with all these new technologies. And so how can we get the business community to embrace that and put that into their system of business and make that a partner, make it part of their supply chain? And then how do we celebrate that to the financial services community and say, look, venture capitalists, here's the wave of the future. Here are the technologies that can save things that everybody's complaining about and talking about, as opposed to saying the world's going to end in 15 years, and unless we all turn off the lights, unless we all stop our cars from idling, unless we all do the right thing, and all sum is a very difficult proposition when you're talking about 7 billion people on the earth, which we all should do the right thing, don't get me wrong. We all should do the right thing, but we need other options that can be more efficient and more effective in the here and the now than 40 years from now.
Do you think ultimately that that's because humans at the micro level, individuals are greedy and they just push and consume and me, now? Is it that as a system, at the macro level, it's capitalism and capitalism is flawed? Or do you think those two things are the same, just parallel? Like, what is the root of the problem? Like, how do we get in this situation where we're destroying the earth, we're killing ourselves? Are we animals and it starts, how do you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the course of history, and I think we haven't looked far enough into the future and taken actions. The decline of the Roman Empire. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I mean, what were the people thinking when they chopped down the last tree on, the Pacific Islands? You need these things in order to survive, but we are moving, and I think as a society, much more from the reptilian brain to the critical thinking brain. When we realize that this isn't the right reaction, it's listening more, and it's trying to understand more, and it's laying the groundwork for the future. And I think when we developed a lot of these things, which have done great things for the earth, by the way, I mean for society, industry has saved us from a lot of different ills. Medicine has saved us from a lot of different ills. We needed to create agriculture the way we did in order to feed people so that, we have the population that we have. So I think when you look at it into that context, what's that Rubicon? Have we gone past that? And that's what we're struggling with right now. So you asked about the millennial generation and what they think, and I think they see that. I think they see a different form of capitalism. I think they see shared services. I think they see, and I hate to say they because it sounds derogatory, but I think they see the world in a very different way that's not as disposable, perhaps, as we have. And there's a new, as you probably have seen, type of housing that's becoming very popular where it's shared communities. There's one in Los Angeles now, and there's, I think for the couple of hundred units that they had, there were 6,000 applications for it. They had an interview with a guy in the LA Times recently who is a very successful entrepreneur who lives in a shared community, who only rides shared services vehicles or micro-transportation. And that is kind of the wave of the new future, is that we don't live in a disposable society. And that transcends not only living, it also goes to food. We're seeing new innovations with food and how can we reuse. One of the biggest things that ends up at landfills. That type of mentality is going to move into the capital markets and into the business community, and that's going to change things. I don't know if that is going to translate into the curmudgeonly, jaded, cynical type of person that I've become from my youth, having wide-eyed looks at the world, because experience does do that. So will it be pulled back a little bit? Sure, like everything else. But it's different. Experience is relative. So, we always talk about experiences over items. And, I totally don't collect cars and, not materialistic in that sense. So I was finally, I work so much, and sometimes I'll just be I'll water the grass just to do something different. So I was outside, and our neighbors, an older couple, the husband was put in an elderly home, so they were having an estate sale. And all these random people are coming and they're buying all this random stuff. And I'm like, life is so funny. You spend all your life accumulating all this crap, for lack of a better word. And in the end, this guy, he's lived a good life. He's in a home. The wife doesn't need this big house. She's moving out. And now it's you're getting rid of it. And I'm like, life is really much simpler than we've made it out to be, where it's I need this and that vase and this table and this and that. But what do you ultimately need? You need some food, you need shelter, you need, just like you said, make sure your kids are happy. Don't mean to be too big, but the point I think I'm making is, I don't know what's happened, but we are seeing more people come to that realization. And the whole purpose of our new brand Context was, hey, executives 20, 30 years ago said, a large number of them said, I don't need to work in this rat race and play this game where I'm basically killing myself to appease some corporation and its shareholders who would dispose of me in a heartbeat. And so they kind of sought some balance. And then I feel entrepreneurs are now coming to the same conclusion, that this idea of literally killing yourself to succeed when you don't even know what the definition of success is
it's kind of like this new, and I do credit, I don't know if it's caused, which came first, but I feel like the younger generation, these millennials that we bundle as one thing and we give them such a hard time and we all say they're lazy and this and that, I kind of feel like maybe, maybe growing up post 9/11, which was an attack on their soil, not like I'm going to Germany to fight World War II, and then the Lehman recession, I feel maybe they kind of got that conclusion sooner, that they're like, well, I don't need to accumulate a car and have, So I feel like maybe we're learning from them, and we should give them a bit more credit than we have.
Oh, we should absolutely give them more credit, because I think they've experienced what we were able to enjoy, but then saw the downside of, which is excess. And they saw the dangers of excess and lived the dangers of excess, where many of us who grew up in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, I worked at a tech startup, in the late 1990s. And, back then it was fashionable to work all the time, right? Like 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-hour days. And that was what made you, cool. If you weren't doing that, you were legacy. Now there's kind of an idea that we can have a full life, and work blends into social life, and social life blends into work. And I think that's why we're seeing an increasingly mobile type of remote worker, shared spaces like WeWork, where there's people that you become friends with and you're working in the same space. I think that blends across many different aspects of life that the millennial generation is enjoying. And when you have a device that can entertain you, that can send stuff to you, that can give you a ride, that can give you your information, that makes life a lot more simple. Yeah. You don't have to go places, you don't have to dress as much, you can shop, that's more efficient for your lifestyle. And I feel like we're living more online, which means the stuff that we have in this corporal world, we don't need as much of.
Yeah, the phone's also become both a shell and a shield in some ways too. So random question to just jump back to. So a lot of people are like, oh, I've always wanted to write a book, but they never get around to it. You've written 10. So what advice do you have for somebody that's trying to write their first book, but they constantly come with one excuse or another?
Yeah, I'm going to steal one of your words. Write crap. Just write. Just keep doing it, even if it's terrible. Even if it's awful. Give yourself a goal, a word count, and just write it. Even if it's terrible. And just keep doing it, and doing it, and doing it. And then go back, and then take a look at everything once you've done the whole enchilada. And then try and fix things up. And hopefully, you'll have something that you can live with at that point. Or at least try and, work on a second, a third, a fourth, fifth, 10th, 12th. It's not easy, but that's a way to do it.
It's a journey, not a destination.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Don't answer. It's like asking me which kid I like more. Which of your books do you like more, you're more proud of? Because 10's a big number. Is there one that you're like, this is the one that...
Yeah, the one I have coming out.
Yeah, no, you can't give that answer. Whenever I interview musicians, it's like, they have like the greatest discography ever, but I'm like, so what's that? They're like, this new one is the great. I'm like, come on, okay, aside from that.
Yeah, but honestly, it really is, just because...
Excluding
the new one.
Which I'm sure is the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Sliced bread is overrated.
Fair enough.
I live in Los Angeles, so we don't do bread.
You don't do it, okay.
You Are Here, I'm very proud of, because I looked at what we do in our everyday life and how that affects people, places, and things all over the world. And then I went there and showed the virtual or proverbial butterfly effect of what we do and how that boomerangs back to us.
Fantastic. Is there anything, I know we've covered a lot, is there anything we haven't discussed that you'd like to touch on?
Just one quick note on education and awareness with communication. I really think that is something that we need to do just as human beings. Forget about the corporate side of everything. We need allies in all the good causes. And someone said it here earlier in one of the panels, when there's an ally, then you are more empowered in a situation. And I feel like we need more of that in the benign sense. And so I think if we can all start to look at our allies and celebrate them and have them celebrate us, we can start to build constituencies that will be very strong from a foundational standpoint and that will be positive, as opposed to trying to demonize each other in certain ways.
Fantastic. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.